He actually was employing about 25 to 30 people in the die casting shop. Franklin, though ever ambitious, was looking for new fields to conquer. And he met a young automotive engineer at this time who appeared to offer the opportunity of something different. John Wilkinson was a native of Syracuse, a person whose family had lived there many years and whose grandfather gave the town its name. Wilkinson was a very athletic young man. In 1885, he went to Cornell to study engineering, and while there, was a member of the first football team at the university, played third base on the baseball team, was a track star, and did a few other things. He graduated in 1889 with a degree in mechanical engineering, returned to Syracuse. At first, he designed machinery at a local firm, then became chief engineer of a bicycle company. And along with designing bikes, he entered bicycle racing contests and won just about every one. In the evening, he began working on designing an automobile. This would have been in the late 1890s. And he finally got some Syracusans to underwrite some of the cost, and he designed his first automobile in January 1900. The people who were backing him financially got cold feet very quickly when they didn't see an immediate profit to be made, and they stopped paying Wilkinson any salary, and he had to look elsewhere for employment. At that time, Alexander Brown, a wealthy inventor, brought Wilkinson together with Franklin, and the two of them, Brown and Franklin, retained Wilkinson to design an automobile. Two experimental cars were built by Wilkinson. Then the third one was judged to be good enough to put on the market, and it was sold in June 1902 to S.G. Averill. The picture here shows the car in the Smithsonian Storage Building near Washington, D.C. This picture perhaps gives a better view of the car, and it was a very interesting machine. The motor was 4 cylinders. Each cylinder was cast individually with fins to aid in the cooling effort. The engine was mounted crosswise in the little car, and there was no fan used, but the engine cooled very well with the natural air coming in through the grill. The vehicle had a planetary transmission, 2 speeds forward, 1 reverse. The transmission gave power to the rear axle through a chain drive. The vehicle had tubular axles because Wilkinson wanted lightweight and particularly light unspun weight. The Franklin Company, after selling the initial car, did very well. And by 1903 and 1904, it was a real competitor in the American auto industry. In 1904, the company decided it would try a cross-country run. And the car, for the same small car, was shipped to San Francisco, and with 2 drivers, it began going across the continent. The trip took 33 days, but was very successful and broke the previous cross-country record almost in half. Franklin, by 1905, had become a strong competitor in the U.S. auto market. And here you note the level at which it operated. It was number 5 in sales, behind Oldsmobile, Cadillac, Rambler, and Ford. Franklin then came out with a 6-cylinder inline engine, again air-cooled, and again it decided to try a cross-country run. Here in this very grim picture, you can see the new 6-cylinder car leaving San Francisco, which 3 days earlier had been hit by the horrible earthquake of 1906. This car again cut the cross-country record, reducing it to 15 days. And in addition to the cross-country run, Franklin participated in the early Glen tours and did very well in them. Franklin himself, Herbert Franklin, was a very astute merchandiser, and he wrote the advertising copy for the company's cars. You can see just a sliver of one of the ads here, but they were effective in pointing out the value of air cooling. The dealer network steadily expanded and reached 157 in March 1909. The firm did some very effective work in training servicemen who, about 3 months after a person bought a Franklin car, the serviceman would contact them to find if there were any problems at all with that vehicle. The company also got into commercial cars. Here we see a cab-over-engine truck. It also built taxis used in New York City and police and ambulance vehicles. Now we are delighted to talk about the 1909 Franklin Series G, this beautiful restored car owned by Christine Gray, who is in the audience. She very kindly made the car available to be exhibited on the floor of Cobo Hall during this function. I urge you to get down there and see it. It is a great machine. The car, in addition to being very attractive in terms of appearance, has a 4-cylinder air-cooled engine featuring auxiliary exhaust, concentric valve, and a hemi-combustion chamber. I am not going to go into these. My colleague, Tom Esmus, is going to tell you more about that. Franklin continued through the years doing quite well with its air-cooled car. In 1916, it came out with the Series 9A. And here, Franklin completely diverged from its competitors. In 1915, Cadillac had come out with a V8 and Packard a V12. John Wilkinson disagreed completely with that approach. And in the 9A, he installed a slightly smaller 6-cylinder air-cooled engine, used a lot of aluminum, and kept the car weight at a very low level. It was an extremely economical car, and it gave 20 or more miles per gallon, and a set of tires on the vehicle lasted 20,000 miles. The Series 9 sold very well, but rather quickly, as it really got underway, America entered the First World War. The Franklin firm was quickly tapped to turn out items needed in the war effort. It built parts for 2 aircraft companies. It had developed a tank transmission for a new American tank and built a small lighting plant that could be used in the front lines. The war ended rather abruptly in November 1918, and Herbert Franklin, foreseeing a big boom in the auto industry, went ahead and expanded his factory greatly. By 1920, the factory had over 34 acres of floor area. In 1921, again in an effort to modernize, the Franklin engineers built a chain-driven assembly line, which aided greatly in the productivity of the Franklin factory. For years, Franklin had not very much in the way of competition in the air-cooled field. But in the early 1920s, this changed. 2 small companies were organized, the Holmes and the Fox, to build air-cooled cars. Both these cars were larger than the Franklin, but they had their problems. The Fox car was very high priced and didn't sell. The Holmes car had a very unattractive design and also didn't sell very well. Both companies failed, and Franklin, for a short time anyway, was rid of competition. However, more serious competition quickly came on the horizon. In 1923, at the auto show in New York, the Chevrolet division of General Motors announced that it would make available to customers an air-cooled car for the Chevrolet model. And you can see a schematic of the engine at the bottom with the top area cut away to give you a look at the valves. The car was designed by the GM Research Lab, headed by Kettering, a very famous engineer. And Chevrolet went ahead and built some 770 or 80 air-cooled 4-cylinder cars. Because of the copper cooling fins fitted into the cylinders, it got the name of the copper-cooled Chevrolet. Unfortunately, when the cars were sold, they did develop problems, and quite an internal dispute arose inside General Motors, the end result of which was that the car was pulled from the market and eventually dropped totally. Franklin, again being without competition, in the mid-1920s, had to look internally, and it decided that its cars were quite unattractive. So a very renowned automotive designer, J. Frank DeCaus, was brought in, and he designed the car that you see here. It was far more attractive than earlier cars. It now had a fake radiator in the front, and the body lines were much improved. And as a result of this, sales of the car definitely improved. By 1927, in a continuing effort to get the public acquainted with the car, when Charles Lindbergh came back from his famous solo flight over the Atlantic, Herbert Franklin presented him with a 1927 Franklin car. It's probably an astute move on the part of Herbert Franklin, since the public would see Lindbergh in many parts of the country driving with a Franklin automobile. By the early part of 1929, Franklin was a small but a very solid automotive company in building its air-cooled vehicles. However, Herbert Franklin, ever ambitious, wanted to expand the company and reach a higher level in sales. So he borrowed a large amount of money, put in new machine tools, acquired a lot of raw materials, and proceeded to turn out a very large number of cars. They sold well for the first half of 1929, but by the end of the summer, sales were dropping off, and then came the stock market crash of October of 29, and that hit the company very hard. It was building a fairly high-priced car, and the sales simply dwindled to almost nothing. In 1930, though, at the beginning of the year, the engineering staff at Franklin had developed a new, still air-cooled car, but much more powerful than anything before. The engine you're seeing here was the so-called side draft Franklin engine, and it encompassed a very good cooling system, higher compression, and very decidedly more power. The firm then used Irwin Cannonball Baker, a famous over-the-road race driver, to put the car through its paces and to develop some speed records. He did very well and broke not only speed records from city to city, but also hill climbing and mountain climbing records. Regrettably, despite all these efforts, and one thing I should have mentioned, in addition to speed records, the new engine introduced in 1930 was put in an airplane, and it actually flew and flew very well. The company, though, with sales dwindling, was hard hit in the year 1930. It had to slash production in half. It eliminated its dividend. It couldn't pay back the bank loan that it incurred in 1929, and it laid off probably half to two-thirds of its employees. Frederick Haynes, who had been head of Dodge, was brought in to try to rejuvenate the company, but he did not succeed. By 1932, at the very depths of the Depression, Franklin clearly was in serious trouble. Again, its engineers came to the rescue and produced a V12 air-cooled engine, the first known in America or even in the world. Unfortunately, the car was costly to build, it didn't sell well in the Depression, and it did not help the company. Then again, a new approach was tried. Franklin did not have a medium-priced car, and what it did was quite ingenious. It met with the Rio people who built the Rio car in Lansing, Michigan, and agreed with them to purchase from Rio a semi-completed car, the entire automobile minus engine and front grille. This unit would be shipped to Syracuse. The Franklin Company would put an air-cooled motor in it, put a new grill on the front, and it would be advertised as the Franklin Olympic. And for a while it sold fairly well. But again, the Depression was still going on and sales once again dwindled. By 1934, the company was in very serious trouble. It couldn't pay its bills to parts companies, and finally it couldn't even pay its employees. The bankers kept putting pressure on it to pay back the loan, but there was no money to do that. Then in April of 1934, the Franklin firm filed a voluntary petition in bankruptcy and entered the bankruptcy process. Again, regrettably, despite strong efforts made, it was not possible for the company to reorganize in bankruptcy, and as a result, it closed its doors permanently. This was the end of the road for the Franklin firm. In 1936 and 1937, two Franklin former engineers developed a new company called Doman Marks, and they laid themselves open for any kind of assignments in the air-cooled field they could find. A wealthy aircraft executives came to them and asked them to build a three-wheeled air-cooled vehicle, which they did. A very attractive little car, front-wheel drive, single rear wheel, four-cylinder, flat engine, which produced a good deal of horsepower. The effort to get financing to build the car on a large scale did not work, and all that was produced was the single pellet model. If you're on the West Coast, believe it or not, this car, the experimental vehicle, still is on display in Los Angeles. The engine in the car was later used to power small aircraft. And then finally, in 1939, Powell Crosley, an entrepreneur in Cincinnati, decided to build a small vehicle. It would be air-cooled, it would seat two people, three in a pinch. Its tiny motor is almost unseen in the bottom of the engine compartment. It produced a full 13 horsepower, and if you kept pushing on the accelerator, the car might make 45 miles per hour. Needless to say, that again, it was a car that did not sell too well. A small number were sold prior to World War II. That then was the end of the road for the air-cooled vehicle in America until after World War II. So thank you very much for listening to this talk, and if you have any questions, I will try to answer them.
Okay, we have time for questions. Yes, sir.
Sinclair, what was the nature of the problem with the copper core? Why did it not work?
I was afraid that that question might come up, and there are many, many debates on that. I tried to do research on it. Roland Hutchinson, who did much of the designing of the copper-cooled Chevrolet engine, was 99 years old when I was making the rounds, and his family would not let me talk to him. He probably had many of the answers. My personal judgment, and this is very much a personal opinion, I think the car was well designed, Actually, it was the Franklin engineers bought a copper-cooled Chevrolet, and they felt the design of the engine was quite good. The manufacturing process, I think, was more difficult, and I think that is where the problem arose. Any additional questions? Yes, sir.
We know that Volkswagen, of course, continued air-cooled engine designs. Was there any interaction between the German engineers and the Americans who were working on air-cooled engines? Or were they kind of independent work?
I think largely independent, although there is a story that both German engineers and Japanese engineers came to the Franklin Company in the early 1930s, before it closed its doors, and looked very carefully at the Franklin engines. Whether that was a carryover to Germany, I don't know. Yes, sir.
The Franklin aircraft engine, is that an offshoot of this company? Do you happen to know?
Well, the Franklin Aircraft Engine Company was the Dolman Marks company originally. There was no specific corporate connection between the two, except that the engineers for Dolman Marks had been engineering executives for Franklin. But apart from that, no other connection.
So they just started using the Franklin brand name, or?
Pardon me?
So they just started using the Franklin brand name on their aircraft?
They acquired the right to use the Franklin brand name out of the bankruptcy.
Is if you get a chance to look at Tucker Motors, they still have the Franklin logo on them.
I know they do, right, but that was converted, and let me make this very clear, because a lot of people think it was an air-cooled engine. It was not. It was a Franklin aircraft engine converted to water cooling. Sorry to have to admit that. Well, thank you very much.
Well, I've got a question.
Oh, yes.
You said the 39 Crosley's were air-cooled. What about the later Crosleys after the war? Were they also air-cooled?
No, they were not. They were water cooled, yes.
All right, second question. Is anything left of that huge plant in Syracuse?
Nothing left.
It's just gone?
It was torn down completely, and a technical high school is now on the site.
Okay.
Well, again, thank you for bearing with me. Take care.
Our next talk will be at 2 o'clock. I didn't realize that the Crestmobile was an airport.
Yes, one of us. Very tiny. You see that script on the internet showing you the little vehicle. Well, it looks like that. Very small.
Because the Crestmobile